This video is brought to you by Poolonomics. What's the difference between chlorine and shock? The answer is a lot simpler than most pool owners realize. Let's start from the top. How is shock different from chlorine? Pool shock or shock treatment is simply a high concentration of chlorine. While you might find some products labeled as chlorine and others labeled as shock, they're really both chlorine with different dosage requirements. Basically, if you add enough chlorine to your water, you're shocking your pool. Where you might typically add 1 to 3 parts per million of chlorine to your water as part of your daily maintenance routine, a shock treatment would contribute many times that amount. It's worth noting there is a type of shock treatment that isn't chlorine, but we'll get to that later. Why would you need that much chlorine? Where your normal or residual level of chlorine is usually enough to keep things in check, high levels of contamination call for a much heavier dose of sanitizer. Perhaps you found an animal in your pool, or lots of leaves and other debris got blown into the water. Maybe someone decided to urinate in your pool, or you simply have a lot of people using it in a short space of time. There's also the used-up chlorine, known as chloramines, that continue to build up in the water and must be removed sooner or later. These scenarios lead to significant and sometimes unexpected levels of contamination that overwhelm your sanitizer, leaving your pool vulnerable to bacteria, algae, and other unfriendly visitors. The goal of using a ton of chlorine, or shocking, is to reach something called breakpoint chlorination, where all contaminants are oxidized and effectively removed from the water. From a chemistry perspective, it's like dropping a nuclear bomb on your pool. Are they really just the same thing? Even though chlorine and shock are one in the same, shock products tend to have certain characteristics that make them more appropriate for their intended use. For instance, it comes in a particular form. Since shocking requires such a high concentration of active sanitizer, it's only ever sold as granular or liquid chlorine because they dissolve very quickly. Granular shock, sold as dichlor, trichlor, or calcium hypochlorite, typically comes in 1-pound bags that are first dissolved in a bucket of water prior to adding it to the pool. As a general rule, you would use 1 bag of granular shock per 10,000 gallons of water. Liquid shock, sold as sodium hypochlorite, typically comes in 1-gallon jugs and can be poured directly into the water as needed since it comes pre-dissolved. Tablets or pucks would never be considered shock treatments as they dissolve far too slowly to reach the required level for breakpoint chlorination. Shock treatments also often work best without stabilizer. Chlorine stabilizer, or cyanuric acid, protects free chlorine from breaking down under the sun's UV light. Without it, an outdoor pool can lose up to 90% of its chlorine in just 2 hours. This is such an important chemical for residential pools that most chlorine products contain cyanuric acid right out of the box, giving it the name stabilized chlorine. While this is incredibly useful for maintaining a residual sanitizer level, a shock treatment only needs to last a few hours, or left overnight, to get the job done. This is why chlorine shock often, but not always, comes unstabilized, allowing the chlorine level to drop back down with a little help from the sun. Of course, this doesn't discount the cyanuric acid already in your water, so that always has to be accounted for. Finally, shock is generally packaged differently to regular chlorine. For example, when using a granular shock, the bags usually aren't resealable as they're intended to be single-use. While liquid shock comes in jugs with resealable caps, they're often sold in larger quantities and aren't suitable for long-term storage. The packaging also won't provide instructions for regular daily use, as they're meant to spike the chlorine level far beyond a residual level. So while it is possible to use shock in place of other chlorine products, it's not nearly as convenient due to how shock is marketed and sold. What about non-chlorine shock? There's always an exception to the rule, and this is it. Non-chlorine shock, monopersulfate, or just MPS is the only shock treatment that isn't chlorine. While chlorine is both an oxidizer and a sanitizer, non-chlorine shock is only an oxidizer, so it's unable to kill living organics like bacteria, viruses, or algae. Instead, it breaks down non-living organic materials such as sweat, saliva, and urine. In doing so, it alleviates stress on your chlorine and allows your residual chlorine level to focus on more serious contamination in the water. If chlorine shock is a nuclear bomb for your pool, non-chlorine shock is more like a tactical airstrike. Overall, despite being called shock, it works in a fundamentally different way from traditional chlorine shock and certainly doesn't replace it. So there you have it, a full breakdown of pool chlorine and shock and the subtle differences between them. Check the description below for links to our full companion article, along with supporting articles for many of the points discussed in the video. We also have a free downloadable and printable checklist to help with your pool maintenance schedule. You can get it for free at poolonomics.com/checklist. That's all from us. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for all things pool care.